All right, good morning, everybody. My name is David Kurtz. I am at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences down in North Carolina. I want to welcome everybody here in the audience as well as everybody online to what I hope and I feel is going to be a really good, productive workshop. I am one of the co-chairs along with Dr. Pat Turner. We had a great committee that worked to develop this workshop, and what I found, and as we went into the development of this, is we had such a diverse group here that brought in so many different perspectives. And I think that's what's important as we approach the development of performance standards. As you will find, and I hope that you will gain, this is not a one-size-fits-all process. But what we hope to do is go through that process so everybody can go back to their institution and say, okay, now I understand a little bit better how to work through this. Here are the issues we got to deal with, and this is how we get through this process and have something solid in place. And that's why we decided to focus not on particular topics of interest. I mean, this is a very important topic for our field. And as the survey that Lita put out there beforehand, we got so many different ideas or topics to discuss. You know, we all realize how important this is. So what we decided to do with this workshop is focus on the process. You know, we decided that if we try to touch on all of these different topics of importance, we'll just all be kind of overwhelmed and not really know how to take that back to our institution. So the goal of this really is the process. And that's why tomorrow is so important, again, because it takes that diverse perspective going into it to come up with a good, strong, valid standard that is acceptable for the institution, is acceptable from the regulatory standpoint, and it can be put in place. So that is our goal, and I hope that we can achieve that goal for everybody here the next 2 days. So with that, we will get started. Our first speaker today is my co-chair for this workshop, and I'm so thankful to be able to work with Dr. Pat Turner. Now, Dr. Turner is a professor in the Department of Pathobiology, and she's program leader of the Graduate Studies in Laboratory Animal Science at the University of Guelph. And her first, our lead-off topic is performance standards for the humane care and use of animals in research. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Turner.
Well, thank you very much, David. And it is a great pleasure for me to be here today. I remember Catherine Bain saying a couple of years ago at a talk that, you know, you've reached a certain age when you're asked to give a history talk. And I guess I've reached that age because this is largely going to be setting the stage for our discussions about performance standards by talking a little bit about how the guide committee approached the development of this topic of performance standards. And I will present as well some examples of standards that are in the guide and how they can be applied as well. So in addition to thanking my co-chair David and the members of this roundtable and Lita for certainly all of their input and assistance, I really wanted also to thank Dr. Jan Garber. Jan is a member of the roundtable. Of course, she was our fearless leader for developing the 8th edition of the guide, and she was unable to join us today because she's traveling, but she was very generous in sharing some of her resources for this talk, so I really like to get my acknowledgments out at the beginning. As everybody knows, the approaches to the use and the care of research animals has been an evolving process, particularly over the last 5 decades in the US, in North America, and around the world. And it's not often that we get to reflect back on the process for how these things have evolved. The development committee for the 8th edition of the guide began their work about 7 years ago now in 2008. And of course, the 8th edition of the guide was published in 2011. So we've had a number of years now to work with this document and to hopefully appreciate some of the information that's in there. During this roundtable, we are going to take apart and parse aspects of performance standards in an attempt to come to a common understanding of how institutions may approach their development. But before we do that, I think it's important at the outset to reflect on the overall purpose of the guide, as this should help to direct us in thinking about what types of performance standards might be appropriate. I want to emphasize that the guide was never intended to be an encyclopedia or a standalone reference, but rather it was intended to be a tool to be integrated with other pieces of information to develop the best care and use practices at any particular facility. The guide sets a tone for the overall approach to the consideration of the use of animals in research. And for the first time, the 8th edition of the guide specifically emphasized the 3 R's: replacement, reduction, and refinement, and the importance that animal well-being has in ensuring integrity of animal research. Of course, cost and efficiency are important considerations, but they shouldn't be considered in isolation. So the guide was really meant to assist institutions in caring for animals used in research, and by institutions, I'm referring to the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, as well as technicians, caregivers, and veterinarians who are working closely with the animals and the research groups on a daily basis. In addition, the guide was meant to assist investigators in planning and conducting their studies. And this is important to ensure scientific rigor. So, thus, the guide recognizes that both the institution and the researcher have a duty to provide humane care to animals used in research. And it provides a foundation for comprehensive animal care and use. And like any good foundation, it's intended to be the basis for a program, a starting point upon which other institutional guidelines and policies can be developed. So with that said, then looking back, I think we can see that the concept of performance standards was really first developed in the 7th edition of the guide. And this was published in 1996. It's a 125-page document, quite succinct. And the actual concept of performance standards was really addressed on page 3 of this document. It's mentioned very briefly in the introduction. But it began to give institutions the flexibility to structure their programs to fit the research needs of the institution. There was really minimal guidance provided, though, as to what that really meant and how to accomplish it. So when it came to developing the 8th edition of the guide, this process, the update process, began in 2008, as I mentioned. There were many new technologies, of course, that had been developed in the intervening years between the 7th and the 8th editions, including very significant electronic communication strategies that really had developed between 1996 and 2011. Many new publications, lots of new information on different topics that were relevant to animal care and use, and an evolving change in the standards of what was considered to be acceptable practices for care and use of animals. In addition to all of these things, there was an evolution in the concept of performance standards. And so the development committee was given this task that performance standards should remain a central feature of the recommendations in the new guide. In reviewing the many notes that arose from submitted written comments and many of the transcripts of verbal communications that were given at the public meetings before the guide development committee began to do its work, there was a very clear message that came from individuals that the committee should continue to emphasize performance standard approaches. And so that was the outcome that was present in the 8th edition of the guide. More information, more references, and more examples, many more examples of how to implement performance standards. The new guide, of course, was expanded to be over 220 pages, so almost double. The previous edition included aquatic environments for the first time, and engineering standards are still a part of this guide, but they're generally meant to provide a minimum or a starting point for consideration of how to best care for animals. And so then it comes back then to the community, the research community, laboratory animal science community, that you really need to be careful what you ask for, because implementing performance standards and developing them is not necessarily an easy process. While they do provide flexibility to institutions, a performance standard approach really requires a mature and experienced outlook to know what might be possible and how it can be achieved. It requires a knowledge of systems and procedures in the context of each institutional program, and it may require significant research and consultation. In addition, it results in a need for careful planning and critical and ongoing assessment of how things are working and whether it is truly benefiting the program and the animals. This can lead to a lot of frustration. Sometimes we hear comments back from individuals, just tell me what I need to do to be in line with the guide. And it also leads to institutions perhaps sometimes defaulting to the engineering standards, which may be the minimum standards that are listed, because it seems easier to do what is written instead of exploring and developing an alternative procedure that might be better suited to the animals being used, the institution, or the specific research needs. So at this point, of course, we come to a number of terms that I should probably define. While they may seem obvious to some people, it's important to be clear about what we're discussing. So I'm going to just give a few definitions here. And the first one I want to talk about is engineering standards. An engineering standard is a standard or guideline that specifies in detail a method, technology, or technique for achieving a desired outcome. It really doesn't provide for any modification in the event that acceptable alternative methods are available. And it's quite prescriptive, therefore, and it provides limited flexibility for implementation. And examples of things like engineering standards might be, that are found in the guide, might be information about 85 to 95% filtration efficiency of exhausted air from animal rooms, minimum space requirement tables, items such as enclosures should be sanitized at least once every 2 weeks, those sorts of things. They are helpful for setting a minimum standard or a baseline, but they aren't necessarily the entire solution. A performance standard, on the other hand, is a standard or a guideline that, while describing a desired outcome, provides flexibility in achieving the outcome. But it's really essential. It's not really, again, a free-for-all. It's essential that the desired outcomes be clearly defined and that appropriate performance measures be regularly monitored to verify the success of the process. And of course, laboratory animal science isn't the only industry that uses, or sector that uses performance standards. They're used in many, many different sectors, such as industrial hygiene standards and small business and banking, for customer service, airline flight tracking and safety, public safety, and even personnel management. So I know we're all very familiar with this concept of performance standard. But again, remembering what it is we're trying to do and regularly trying to verify it are important aspects of a performance standard. It isn't a static document once it's prepared. So when we come to considering then engineering versus performance standards, it's really a balance between them. Ideally, we have the two of them. We have a target for achieving optimal practices for management and operations, and at the same time, this encourages flexibility and the use of professional judgment based on individual situations. So we often need to have this baseline, which is what the engineering standard can sometimes give us, as it gives us a starting point from which to work. The last definition I really want to talk about is practice standards. And practice standards are really the application of professional judgment to a task or a process over time, which has been demonstrated to benefit or enhance animal care and use. And again, we see practice standards for laboratory animal science continuously evolving. These are often used in the absence of scientific literature or other definitive information, but where experience demonstrates that a particular practice is beneficial to animal care and well-being. Practice standards are often applied in the context of various professions, such as nursing or human medicine or veterinary medicine and their related specialties like laboratory animal medicine. And they really encompass a very broad base of knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behaviors of individuals who are part of that profession, in this case, working within the field of laboratory animal science. really helps to, these help to define what is deemed acceptable in terms of approaches to animal care and use and what is not. So again, in veterinary medicine, examples of practice standards might be, for example, collecting temperature, pulse, and respiration as part of the data set for an animal when performing a physical exam, ensuring proper record keeping is kept for medical cases, collecting informed consent when enrolling animal patients in clinical trials. These are all examples of practice standards. And we can see this within laboratory animal science as well, that we have certain standards that are now deemed to be accepted, and going backwards just isn't going to be an option. So if they are so challenging then to develop at times, then why use practice standards? Well, for a couple of reasons. They provide significant flexibility to institutions if they are used properly to modify and update practices and procedures as new information becomes available. So they allow institutions and researchers to be responsive to new information that comes out. In addition, they permit changes in practices without legislative changes, and this permits a real timeliness and reduces expenses associated with these sorts of changes. And certainly for the guide committee, this was the intention for the 8th edition of the guide. It was meant to be a living document that changed as new information became available. So the information in the guide and other resources that are used to set standards of care for laboratory animals is largely based on the scientific literature. There were definitely gaps at the time in 2008 when the committee came together, just as there are continuing gaps today in aspects of laboratory animal science. And we know that information changes with time. So using performance standards is a means of recognizing and addressing the changes in knowledge with time. So what's the basis then for applying change to performance standards over time? Well, the information for this often comes from peer-reviewed literature and can also come from time-proven experience in the field, things that have worked at the facility for a long time that really seem to augment the care of animals. It can come from modification of practices and procedures with changing conditions and with new information that's gained. And all of these may lead to modification of existing practices or development of new performance standards over time. So how do we recognize a good performance standard when we see one? Really, again, I want to emphasize that the performance standard defines the outcomes that are expected. It's a balance then of engineering standards. These may set the baseline or set a starting point for these. It should provide for some flexibility, recognizing that there are many ways to achieve the goals. And it should use appropriate language. And I'll just make a comment here about interpreting must, should, and may as it applies to performance standards. So we see these terms used quite a bit in the guide. And of course, institutions may use these terms when they are developing performance standards for in-house use as well. And I just want to remind people of what are being referred to with these. Must, of course, indicates actions that the committee considered to be imperative and that are a mandatory duty or requirement for a facility to follow. Should indicates a strong recommendation for achieving a goal. However, the committee recognized that individual circumstances in a facility might justify an alternative strategy, and may was intended to indicate a suggestion to be considered. It's very tempting when developing performance standards to make everything a must, but it's really important to be reasonable in the approach. If something is unlikely to be achieved in every instance, then we're setting the facility up for failure. So we need to ask always, is it absolutely essential in every case to have a certain standard in place for ensuring or enhancing animal welfare or safety, for example? Should and may are also very powerful words. And the terms to which they apply can also become the norm as practice standards evolve over time. And we've seen this for a number of different performance standards, such as social housing, which in the guide is a should, but we've seen it sort of become a requirement in facilities over time. Okay. And again, thinking about practice standards, which is sort of a larger area for all of performance standards, can lead to changes in the standard of practice. When we think about the care and use of animals in research, these evolve over time as well. They can begin locally at one institution. It can begin as the implementation of a performance standard for a specific situation. And through time, by monitoring, evaluating, and validating the success of the approach, these can then change the standard of practice in the care and use of animals. I really want to emphasize how important it is for people to share changes in performance standards, to present these, and particularly to publish these. And we're going to talk about these over the course of the roundtable, and we'll talk about different ways that we can get this information out. But I want to emphasize this, not just because I'm an academic, but because otherwise it remains part of the gray literature. And the gray literature is a term for information that falls outside the mainstream of published journals and monographs. So it's not controlled by commercial publishers, and it includes things like hard-to-find studies, reports and dissertations, conference abstracts and papers, government or private sector research, various clinical trials that might be ongoing and unpublished. All of these can be prepared by experts and researchers in the field, but publishing makes this information accessible and adds to the credibility of the work that's done. I think we've all had the experience of seeing a really interesting talk or reading an interesting poster at a meeting and wanting to take that information back home and to use it to support a concept or even to support a grant, but finding it very difficult to cite these and have them accepted as rigorous pieces of work. Lynn mentioned in her introductory talk that rigor is expected when developing performance standards. These should be evidence-based, and by evidence I mean empirical, so based on observations, not necessarily anecdotal. These practice standards may not fit all situations, but they may, or these performance standards that can be developed may not fit all situations, but they may illustrate an approach that's useful for other situations. This evolution in the practice of laboratory animal medicine and laboratory animal science can be a source of frustration for researchers and for institutional officials and administrators who may feel that the ground is constantly shifting under their feet. But it really represents a change. I see it as a very beneficial thing. It's a change in our knowledge and expectations. It's an increase in our level of care for the animals, and it can occur over time. So at this point, I'd like to move into a few examples then that are present within the guide and talk about some examples of how the text was written and how they provide for approaches to performance standards. And this is really meant as to get people warmed up for subsequent discussions on performance standards that will occur later this morning and this afternoon. So the topics that I've chosen for this are temperature, social housing, environmental enrichment, and I'm going to say a little bit about cage and pen space and how those comments were developed. I'm not going to say too much about this because I think we're going to have another example tomorrow morning on this. So we'll see how those were used further by one institution. So I'm going to combine, in discussing these, I've taken some information that comes directly from the text of the guide, and then I will talk about what those implications are for an institution when they are developing their performance standard around it. The first one is really considering temperature. Of course, the information for macroenvironmental temperatures is given in table 3.1 of the guide. And there are comments in there about rodents, and rodents being collectively describing mice, rats, guinea pigs, hamsters, and other species being kept at temperatures of 20 to 26 degrees Celsius. The guide indicates that these generally reflect tolerable limits, provided that animals are housed with adequate resources for behavioral thermal regulation. Even at the time that this information was developed, we didn't have all the papers that are out today that discuss thermal regulation needs and nesting material and that sort of thing for mice, but it was recognized at the time that those were very important things. The guide also indicates that the temperature should be selected and maintained with minimal fluctuation near the middle of these ranges. So a couple of specific points in here which pertain to it. And it's important, again, and I'll emphasize this as well when we come to cage space, that while it's easy just to look at the tables, which gives some indication of engineering standards, it's really important to take the tables in context with the text to get the full meaning of what was intended. So the guide goes on to state that the ambient temperature in which thermal regulation occurs without the need to increase metabolic heat production or activate evaporative heat loss mechanisms is called the thermal neutral zone, and this is bounded by the lower and upper critical temperatures. The guide recommends that dry bulb temperatures in animal rooms should be set below the animal's lower critical temperature to avoid heat stress. And this in turn means that animals should be provided with adequate resources for thermal regulation, things such as nesting material and shelter to avoid cold stress. And the thermal neutral zone for mice is recognized to be 26 to 34 degrees, while the lower critical temperature, the temperature at which they can start to have heat stress, is 26 degrees Celsius. So the implications for this are that when animal room temperatures are set lower, which does occur in many facilities, as recommended in the table, that sufficient nesting material should be provided to these animals. And again, that variation around a set temperature should be minimized. And we have seen in recent publications that this definitely is the case, that for animals to be able to maintain their temperature, they need to have sufficient nesting material when the room temperatures are lower. The guide goes on to list circumstances that might require additional consideration, such as animals recovering from surgery when they may be immobilized and unable to thermoregulate properly, neonates of many species, which are essentially poikilotherms that are unable to generate heat in response to cold stress, hairless rodents, and so on. So that's one example then of how performance standards can be applied then in terms of temperature settings in a facility or within an animal room. Another example of a performance standard is social housing. And again, information taken directly from the guide indicates that all animals should be housed under conditions that provide sufficient space, as well as supplementary structures and resources required to meet physical, physiologic, and behavioral needs. Single housing of social species should be the exception and should be justified based on experimental requirements or veterinary-related concerns about animal well-being. Social animals should be housed in pairs or groups of compatible animals unless they must be housed alone for experimental reasons or because of social incompatibility. So again, here's the performance standard that facilities then are meant to take and apply to their individual situation. And the implications then of this for facilities is that really it requires an understanding of species typical social behavior. We know that, of course, cage complexities and various resources need to be provided in such a way that they can't be monopolized by a dominant animal or that they cause aggression to be elicited between animals. It also means that the need for single housing should be reviewed rigorously on a regular basis and approved by the Institutional Animal Care Committee and or the veterinarian. And some of the implications for this has meant that institutions have examined much more closely their ability to socially house certain species. For example, male macaques and other non-human primates, male mice of different strains. It turns out that we can group house Balb-C males in isosexual groups for long periods of time with minimal agonistic behavior, but we need to establish those groups by 5 to 6 weeks of age before sexual maturity and house them with lots of environmental resources to reduce agonistic behavior. Many institutions are still trying to work out whether and how laboratory rabbits can be pair or group housed in research settings. So we see this as a continuing and evolving process in terms of our knowledge of social housing. But without this performance standard requirement, it really wouldn't be forcing institutions to think at and look at some of these practices a little bit more closely. Another example then of performance standard is environmental enrichment. And again, just to take the performance standard from the text, Enrichment programs should be reviewed by the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, researchers, and the veterinarian on a regular basis to ensure that they are beneficial to animal well-being and consistent with the goals of animal use. Personnel responsible for animal care and husbandry should receive training in the behavioral biology of the species they work with to appropriately monitor the effects of enrichment, as well as identify the development of adverse or abnormal behaviors. Again, the implications of this is that we recognize that resources and various enrichment strategies are important, but that they need to take into account the scientific goals of the study, and that enrichment, as has been determined by various papers, should be considered an independent variable and suitably controlled for in studies. In terms of training, personnel responsible for the daily care of animals should be familiar with normal animal behavior, such that abnormal behavior may be recognized and reported. And there are lots of good ideas for enrichment out there, but we always need to balance the animal and the study needs. This requires a lot of good communication and an understanding of what the project is about. Okay, another example, which certainly generated a lot of comment and interest by the research community, is the idea of cage and pen space. And again, here's the performance standard coming from the guide. And note that while many skip the text and go directly to the accompanying tables, it's really critical to ensure that people read the text so that they have appropriate interpretation of the tables. So the text indicates that at a minimum, animals must have enough space to express their natural postures and postural adjustments without touching enclosure walls or ceiling, be able to turn around and have ready access to food and water, and in addition, there must be sufficient space to comfortably rest away from soiled areas. In addition, the cage height should take into account the animal's typical posture and provide adequate clearance for the animal from cage structures such as feeders and water devices. And finally, that sufficient space should be allocated for mothers with litters to allow pups to develop to weaning without detrimental effects for the mother or the litter. So an animal's space needs are complex, and the tables that were provided that accompany this are really recommended minimums. Consideration of only the animal's body weight or surface area may be inadequate in determining how much space an animal needs. And it turns out that animal space needs may vary by sex as well as by age and possibly even by strain. It's not necessarily always convenient to consider all of these things, and so for that reason, the tables provide a minimum space recommendation for animals. So we need to consider all of these things when determining the space needs of an animal and also the cage resources that might be employed under these conditions. The space allocations definitely should be assessed and reviewed and modified as necessary by the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee concerning various performance indices such as health, reproduction, growth, behavior, age, sex, activity, and use of the space, and any other special needs that are determined by the characteristics of the animal strain or the use of those animals. One particular subpoint within this was the topic of rodent breeder cages. And again, I'm not going to discuss this in great detail, but previous editions of the guide lacked any kind of information regarding space needs for a female plus their litter. And at the time, there were a number of guidelines for other countries or regions around the world that did provide some specific information. So this was perceived as a gap, a big gap in the guide. So the guide does provide recommended space for a female plus litter, and this was based on sort of current standard of practice in some breeding operations. And again, it was intended to be a starting point for addressing space needs of the breeding groups. A comment in the guide indicates that other breeding configurations may require other space and will depend on considerations such as the number of adults, litters, the size, and the age of the litters. So some may require more or less space than those that are indicated. And factors that might need to be considered as part of this would include things like the need for having to cull animals because of overcrowding, sanitation frequency, and the age of the litters. So these are really just some examples then that I pulled from the guide. There's many, many examples that can be found in every chapter. And again, the interpretation of these and how they're implemented can be individualized to some extent to institutions depending upon their needs. So when do we need to develop new performance standards? Well, we've discussed this already. As new information becomes available that challenge existing approaches, certainly when conditions arise that are not adequately covered in the guide, or when insufficient guidance exists on a particular topic. These are all times when we might need to develop new performance standards. Between the 6th and the 7th edition of the guide, there were 11 years. Between the 7th and the 8th edition of the guide, there were 15 years. And there's a vast amount of information that becomes available always in these intervening years. As I mentioned at the outset of this talk, it's not just about cost savings and efficiency. Performance standards should not be developed at the expense of animal health and well-being, or if it interferes with the science that's being conducted. And this is why some validation is required when we are developing new performance standards. There's many situations that are not covered in explicit detail in the guide, and the principles that are mentioned in the guide are intended to provide an ethical approach for all animals used in research, including agricultural animals, birds, wildlife, for field studies, and for invertebrates such as cephalopods. Fish are mentioned in the 8th edition of the guide for the first time, but fish as a species encompasses over 30,000 species, so there's no way that sufficient detail for these animals can be found in the guide. And we do need performance standards for these various species. I wanted to conclude again by re-emphasizing what should be considered when developing a performance standard, and this information comes directly from the guide, and it's also highlighted in OLA's FAQ on this topic. So when we are developing a performance standard, the following criteria really should be considered. It should support the scientific objectives of the animal work. It should support the health and welfare of the animals. It should have outcome criteria associated with it, and these outcomes should be regularly monitored for success. So really, in summary, the 8th edition of the guide is heavily reliant on the development and implementation of appropriate performance standards to enhance research animal well-being. This approach allows for institutions to be responsive and to implement actions in a timely way as new knowledge appears. It still requires rigor and validation to ensure that the outcome is as good or better than the previous performance standards. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Turner, for a really good overview on what it took to get to where we are and kind of the ideas of how we want to move forward. So we are ahead of schedule. It's a good way to start out. So what we'll do is we were going to go ahead and take a break after this one. It's always a good on the first day when everybody gets in and they're rushing to go ahead and take that bio break really soon afterwards. So let's go ahead and take our break, and instead we will come back and start back at 10 till 10. And then we'll start, so we'll take a 20-minute break as scheduled, but we'll start back a little bit early, and hopefully we can stay on schedule or stay a little bit ahead through lunch. Okay, so we'll be back at 10 till. Thank you.